Hello and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we are taking a break from the usual format and I'm doing an end of year special. It has been a phenomenal year for me and I launched the podcast 9 months ago and it has done way better than I expected. Thank you to every single one of you listening. Thank you so much to every single one of my guests who comes on here, shares their time and their knowledge for me and for you. Thank you for everyone who has contacted me, made connections, interactions, the encouragement and support. And especially for those of you who are sharing as it is slowly growing, and that is wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm going to give a shout out to a few podcasts here because podcasting can get very isolating. So huge thank you to Lawhounds who contacted me and we did a crossover on Alien earlier this year. So they do a podcast which focuses on various shows, including, and this might interest you, Silo, Severance, Dune Prophecy. They do deep dives. They are respectful of any book spoilers. So definitely worth checking out the Lawhounds. M from Verbal Diorama, lovely woman who does these solo deep dives into very popular films. Really worth a listen. And the wonderful Mark Steadman is about to launch a new podcast called Undo, which looks at outliers and kind of people who are a little bit left field through history and how they got stuff done. So it's cutting through a lot of the newer productivity BS that we get thrown at us through social media and various channels. Definitely check that out. I have heard the first episode and it was thoroughly enjoyable. I've listened to all of these podcasts and I do recommend them, not just because they are made by lovely people, but because the content is really good. So take a look at the show notes for links to those. Now on to this episode. If you want to find out more about the episodes and the guests, take a look at the show notes. Here, I asked Julian and Jess, who were guests on the Pulps, Comics and Superheroes episode, a very simple question. A question that I think most children have probably asked at some point in their lifetimes. Jess, who is your favourite superhero?
Superman, but not because of, not the reason you think. I think of Superman as the ultimate super dad. He's patient. He's kind. He's got a dad. He tells dad jokes. He's an ideal father figure in an industry that is not welcoming of father figures. My favorite superhero is really the Superman that's in my head more than is on the page.
Very interesting. So it reminds me actually because I'm a bit of a Trekkie and I grew up on The Next Generation and I feel that way about Jean-Luc Picard. I'm like, he's my celebrity dad. That's why I love him. Julian, who's your favorite superhero?
My favorite superhero of all time since I was a kid was Iron Man. It's Iron Man. That question is often unfair for me, I feel like, because I obviously love a lot of superheroes, but if you're going to go like, what's the character from a kid? I'm like, Iron Man. And then maybe Black Panther, but Iron Man. Because I love the idea of like someone just really bright and he just makes stuff and solves problems.
Okay, right? So is that because you liked him as a kid, or even now you're like, oh, I want more Iron Man films, I want more Iron Man comics?
Oh, I still love Iron Man, and I am personally very frustrated that they won't do this last run was okay with Gary Duggan. He actually did a good run of Iron Man during the Krakoan age. But yeah, I still read Iron Man. I still read it, right? Like I'm always reading it. I'm reading a lot of stuff, but I still read Iron Man. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think for me, growing up, it was Superman, and then for female superheroes, I just always hate the fact that the best ones always go crazy. So I feel like there's Jean Grey goes crazy. Jean Grey goes crazy. Scarlet Witch goes crazy. Like a lot of the kind of really powerful, cool ones.
Does Jean Grey go crazy? Really? Is that
with
fair?
The Phoenix Force? She does.
I would just argue that Jean Grey did not go crazy as much as Jean Grey was. She was pushed into an untenable situation, and at the end of that story, she reasserted her sense of self.
Okay.
She blew up a planet though. Or blew up the sun.
Just a bad day.
You know, there's a lot of destruction in superhero comics, and I that story in particular has always been one where I'm like, there are a lot of male characters that do bad things, and we don't go like, hey, we can never love them. I'm like, really? So I'm just not about going like, oh yeah.
I quite like Squirrel Girl. I was introduced to Squirrel Girl by a friend of mine called Matt, and I just love the fact that it's just
you should check out Moon. You should check out Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur.
Okay, I will. And aside from that, I say I've got superhero fatigue, but I am somewhat obsessed with the Spider-Verse. And if they make the third episode equal, if not better, equal, it's going to be my favorite trilogy of all time. Like, it's literally me and my daughter and probably my son were like, any time of the day, anywhere, we can watch this. My daughter actually said to me, you can wake me up in the middle of the night to watch this. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, guys. Okay, so the King Kong episode of the podcast was the longest recording I had, and it was very, very difficult to cut it down to a digestible size. I asked Mark Bold about the cuts that were made to the original film. Here he talks about one of the scenes that was originally cut due to the Hays Code being enforced not too soon after King Kong was originally released.
The most notorious one is where Kong peels Andaro's clothes off and then sniffs his fingers. And it's such a sexually charged moment that it really does leave you, oh, what's going on? What do I make of this? Is this just ape-like curiosity, or is there something much more sexual in that going on in that contact? But it's also one of the ways the effects work as well is one of the things the production code's really anxious about and actually forbids depictions of is miscegenation, interracial sexual relationships. And at that moment, that's what we're confronted with on some level. But because it's effects work and live action footage composited together, there's still quite a secure boundary between the giant black ape figure and this screaming blonde in her underwear.
Here, Peter talks about the makers of King Kong, Ernest Schoedsack and Merian C. Cooper, and what kind of lifestyles they lived before they went to settle down and make massive Hollywood films. They had very, very exciting lives and were involved in military operations in Europe.
He really went to places that were quite dangerous and uncharted, to Papua New Guinea, to Sumatra, to South America. And he also was... He was a very staunch anti-communist during the period of the great global revolutions and the World War. And so he and Ernest Schoedsack as well signed up to volunteer in the aftermath of World War I, during World War I, but then in the aftermath also during the Russian Civil War to fight on behalf of effectively the Western powers and the White Russians in an effort to restore the monarchy, or in any case, oust the Bolsheviks. And so they were where the action was in the early 1920s. I mean, these are still relatively unknown episodes in world history. The shadow war that the British, with Americans and French and Polish volunteers, fought against the early Bolshevik Red Army. And he was imprisoned, Merian C. Cooper. He was captured, but he managed to not get himself executed by assuming a false identity. And he claimed if had they known that he had previously been the squadron leader of an American Air Force squadron, then they would surely have executed him. And he had numerous escapes and near escapes. And it's really unbelievable when you read about these guys, that the kind of life they led prior to King Kong.
Peter, who was not permitted to watch King Kong as a small child, talks about one of his favourite legacies from the film.
I also wanted to say one of my favorite nods to King Kong is in Rocky Horror Picture Show, which ironically my parents did let me watch. So even before I saw Kong, and I didn't like the Rocky Horror Picture Show as a 13-year-old because it was way ahead of where I was in my development. But what I did get were many of the filmic references, especially in the lyrics, including in the opening song, Midnight Double Feature Picture Show, Whatever Happened to Fay Ray, her sweet satin-draped frame And I always remembered that line. And later it says something went wrong for Fay Wray and King Kong. And there are all these references to Fay Wray and King Kong in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, as well as sundry other science fiction and fantasy films that sort of another more evidence of the significance of this text within the larger body of fantasy / science fiction horror genre.
Metropolis is only a few years away from being 100 years old. The film carries so many of the tropes for science fiction that we see today in cinemas, including one of my favourites, the mad scientist. Sonia Fritchie and Noah Eisenberg speak about the mad scientist in Metropolis, Rotwang. He seems like such a good prototype of the mad scientist. Can we talk a bit about where that prototype might have come from? Is it from books like Frankenstein and maybe the early version of Frankenstein and the kind of influence it's had going forward?
Yeah, I do really see him coming partially, of course, out of the story of Frankenstein, but really out of the monster films that had been coming out, and German expressionism. I mean, if you really think about how his makeup, how he moves with his hands, it's really, I know this is a silent film, but really with him, where with Furter you have the expressionist acting with the hands, the holding in the heart, but it's really pronounced with Rotwang. And you also then have someone who's been wronged. Furter's son stole his love, and he has been churning with that. I mean, he has this statue in his house, and that's interestingly something that we didn't know until the new footage was discovered. So you didn't quite understand what Rotwang's mental challenges were, and it's really he's where you've got the others, who are living up in the city, and that's really an external type of progress. Rotwang is really churning with and thinking about emotion and the having the really the expressionist type of piece of this film, and that's where you get to the madness. That's where you get to the but also the brilliance and the romanticism of this character that I think is important. He's the lone genius, right?
And the actor Rudolf Klein-Roge, who plays Rotwang, had also played Mabuse in just a few years earlier. He was the star of Dr. Mabuse, the gambler, and he has this hypnotic power, and I think that the character of Rotwang really does, as Sonia points out, harken back to earlier horror films, horror / sci-fi. If we think of the Golem, for instance, and Thomas Elsässer in his BFI Film Classics volume, he makes a point of comparing Rotwang to Rabbi Löw, in the Golem. That is this kind of. So
just to clarify, the Golem film came out kind of in the 19-teens, was it?
No, 1920. Comes out in 1920.
Okay. And
1920.
It's a kind of a monster which is made to kind of protect. The Jewish people against kind of anti-Semitism.
Yes, right? The Prague ghetto. Yeah, the story harkens back to the 16th century, but yes, it's another case where you have this sort of blend of alchemy, magic, Kabbalistic writing, so Jewish mysticism. But the point is, I think, with Klein-Roge's portrayal of Rotwang, is again you get this kind of it's a character who's marginalized, who's outside, who's marked as different. The pentagram, the house in which the house that he occupies, the location that he physically occupies in the film, and I think that that's really important. Again, in terms of seeing the different layers of Metropolis and the different, and it is very much it's an architecturally conceived film. It's no surprise that there were some 135 architects who were employed, and that architecture again was Lang's original training and background. That, and I mentioned the studio arts, painting, and Sonia was referencing, if I could just go back to that briefly, visually, whether it's in the scene in the Soviet Union with Russian constructivists, or whether it's in France with Ferdinand Léger and his depictions of the city, whether it's in Italy with, Umberto Boccioni, The City Rises, and the futurist portrayal. All of this is on display. But Rotwang occupies, it's almost as if he's living in some sort of almost medieval city. And when he's in the catacombs, one of the great scenes of the film is when he's in a very predatory. It really says suggestions of rape, essentially. When he's hunting down Maria with the torch, with the camera, with the flashlight, and which serves essentially as camera at that moment. That world, the catacombs, and Rotwang's very separate from what's happening in the upper echelons of Joe Frederson's world, of the industrialist technocrat world.
Staying on topic, for the episode on Mad Scientist, I spoke to Xavier and Tom about their favourite examples of that trope. I'm going to try out this little thing where I'm going to ask both of you what and why and who is your favourite mad scientist?
Xavier goes first.
Can I have more than one?
Go for it. I want more than one. Go for it.
Brilliant. I'm going to go for three. I have to say Dr. Frank-N-Furter, not just because I love the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but because he has all of the traits of the mad scientist, and he does it with style. He wears fishnets and has a brilliant number or a series of them. So I'm going to go with Frank-N-Furter. I'm going to go with Seth Brundle from The Fly, because I absolutely love Cronenberg, and I think his tragedy is the tragedy of the mad scientist and of humankind more generally, where you become embroiled. I think what Thomas was saying there about technology is really interesting, because of course we are becoming inextricable from the technology we're creating. I can no longer go to a foreign country without my phone. That's a form of technological dependence. We have become our machines. And I think Seth Brundle in Becoming Fly sort of epitomizes that quite nicely. And then just to add a bit of a feminine flavor, because we've talked about female scientists, does Dana Scully count as a mad scientist? She's not that mad, but I like the tension between religion and scientific reason that she brings to the X-Files. So those are my three.
I don't think she's bad at all, but I'm going to let you have her because she's awesome. So, okay. Thomas, how about you?
Oh, I got to go to the figure that inspired Dr. Frank-N-Furter, which is Dr. Frankenstein. I think that the great original of that, both in the book and the motion picture, because not only does he establish the template for the mad scientist figure, but he's there's something really poignant about him, which is that he wants to do something fairly reasonable, which is bring back people from the dead. And he's kind of caught in the system where the only way he can do it is to get this, assistant who can help him steal bodies. And rationally enough, we have this power of electricity now, which is performing miracles. So there's something kind of ambitious and rational and decent about Dr. Frankenstein. And of course, once he actually creates the monster, it starts going horribly wrong to him. And I just do like the Colin Clive portrayal because it is so flamingly gay and over the top. It's alive. And the minute he creates a man, if he ever was interested in his girlfriend to get married, it's all over. It's definitely, he's got another interest now on the side. So the film is just so multi-layered in so many ways. And then, of course, the Frankenstein creature is absolutely wonderful.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to go with, I feel like going with one of the Boris Karloff films because I've watched so many of them in the last few weeks. So I'm going to go with The Man with 9 Lives because he's such a, he's being treated so unfairly as he is in many of these films. And I'm not saying we should all turn to murder when we are being treated unfairly, but I'm saying it's understandable why he had to go to those lengths.
I don't advocate it, but I understand it.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I just want to mention Metropolis and Rotwang because I expected one of you to say that. And so I just wanted to say because it cinematically, it feels like such a prototype. Which, after watching Metropolis and learning about it and everything, I think so many of our prototypes come from that film. There's a whole podcast on it. I won't go on about it too much. And aside from that, I'm a child of the 80s, so I'm going for 3, just like you, Xavier. I'm going to go for Doc Emmett Brown, because he's a nice mad scientist, even though he's very, very clever. So those are my 3. Do you want to add any more, Tom? Are you good with your 1?
I think I can't top Dr. Frankenstein unless you go for the Mel Brooks version of Frankenstein. That would be the other. You mentioned Frank-N-Furter, that the creature has been so duplicated over the years, and so in America we actually devoted a stamp to Frankenstein and the Mummy, and so at a certain point these creatures become like beloved comrades of your childhood, and they no longer engender the kind of prototypical fear that they're supposed to. So by the time you get to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, he's kind of, he's lost his speedball in terms of his ability to actually scare us.
As regular listeners know, we tend to stick to films for the podcast, but early this year I learned about Robert Duncan Milne, who was a pioneer of science fiction literature and short stories in the late 19th century, writing about many, many topics which were way ahead of his time. For that episode, I asked academics Keith and Ari which one of Milne's stories they would like to see turned into a film. And if you can throw in some casting choices, that would be wonderful. So tell me about the story, what is it, and who would star in that film? Keith first.
I have a particular soft spot for a story called Baron von Steinbach's Soul. It's one of Milne's Professor Fair series. And these stories generally concern new inventions that enable you to enable you to, as it were, sort of visualize what's happening, or to project yourself across to the other side of the world as a kind of surveillant presence. So what happens in Baron von Steinbach is that the Baron in question, and it's a bit of a sorcerer's apprentice cautionary tale, he sneaks in and uses the Baron's apparatus to detach his consciousness and project it back to Berlin from San Francisco, so that he can keep an eye on his fiancée, as it were. But unfortunately, there's a twist in the story that the Baron's dog also gets into the apparatus with him. And as their consciousnesses are called back from Berlin to San Francisco, their souls get swapped into the wrong body. So it's an extraordinary piece of writing, because the latter part of the story is presenting the world from the viewpoint of a dog which has a human consciousness in it, and is able to kind of present what it feels like to be, how it is able to present how humans kind of mistreat animals, from that kind of human point of view. It's also extraordinarily anticipatory, because it's basically about a kind of teleportation. So it's also incredibly anticipatory of that short story, The Fly, and the various film versions of it, where human DNA gets mixed up with an insect, with it resulting kind of horrifying results. I could certainly see this being turned into a film, because it's highly visual and visually self-reflexive, or even some kind of immersive virtual reality production of an experimental kind. And my sort of ideal choice for casting would be Anthony Hopkins as Professor Fair, and possibly Benedict Cumberbatch as the young Baron. But
I like those choices.
It would give it some gravitas.
It definitely would.
Well,
Ari, you'd also mentioned that people at this time had kind of a fear of being potentially watched. And I think science fiction reflects anxiety a lot. So it's interesting that you chose the story, Keith, because I assume that once the camera or stories of the camera came about, that could have been quite like a valid fear.
Yes, absolutely. The Baron is like an invisible camera eye, sort of moving around the room at this ball and able to move through walls and so on, and to kind of, travel anywhere in the world that he wants to go. So this invisible surveillant presence has got some real ambiguity about it, and it's slightly creepy as well, particularly in relation to, sort of watching his girlfriend when she doesn't know he's there.
Yeah, and Milne has plenty of these stories about surveillance. He was obviously obsessed. He even had this idea about implanting a small microphone, basically, in the necklace of a lover in order to keep tabs on her. So these stories continually recur in his works. And also, as for Baron von Steinbeck, how many times have we seen a modern comedy film of a, loving father being trapped in the body of a dog or some sort of animal swap? We can confidently say Milne did it first. So it's a great one to choose, Keith.
Okay, Ari, what's your choice for the big screen?
Well, one of my favorite stories that I continually come back to in Milne is called A New Palingenesis. This is one of my favorites because it's a very, very unusual idea. So basically in this story, our narrator visits the house of a doctor friend that he knows, and he comes in and sees that his wife is dying, clearly unwell, on the bed, on her deathbed, dying of consumption, as it was called back in the day. And he says, should I leave? This seems a little bit like, should I give you guys your space? Your wife is dying. And he says, oh, don't worry about it. Actually, I need your help with something. And he says, oh, I'm happy to be of help. And he says, okay, well, can you help me carry my wife? And he says, all right. So, they lift her on both ends and carry her into what looks like this glass coffin and lie her down in there. And he says, okay. And then, oh, can you help me move this giant glass slab? And he does, and puts it over the coffin, thus sealing her in this glass coffin. And he immediately thinks, hold on, she has no air in there. She's going to suffocate to death. And he says, yes, exactly. And immediately he wants to leave and finds the doorknob is electrified. So he's going to get electrocuted if he leaves. So immediately we have this sort of exciting setup where he's trapped in this mad scientist who is about to suffocate his wife. And he thinks, what are you doing? And he says, have faith, right? And he says, did you see that? Look at the coffin. You almost just saw the moment that her electrical intelligence left her body and was captured in this little sort of globe that he has attached. And he says that was the moment her soul left her body. Of course, in the most scientific way possible. He goes on a whole talk about how her electrical intelligence, we all have a electrical intelligence, sort of like DNA powering us and giving us our distinct personality traits. So it's an anticipation of DNA in that way. And also sort of combined with ideas of spiritualism and the soul. Cutting edge science at that time for most scientific believers. This was the belief at the time. And of course, he takes it to the next level and he says, my wife is beyond healing. She has a disease in her body. So what I'm going to do, and he, of course, introduces this, it starts to fill up and her body is starting to be dissolved. He says, I'm going to dissolve my wife down to her elements, and I'm going to use this spark, this electrical intelligence that I've captured in order to rematerialize her body without her illness. And that's exactly what he does. So for this story, it's a very exciting story. Of course, you can read it in our upcoming anthology in full, but I imagine maybe Anya Taylor-Joy as the, consumption suffering wife. She has that sort of look to her, this ghostly look. And maybe for the mad scientist, I don't know, maybe who do we think? RDJ, maybe? I don't know. We might throw in somebody from the Marvel universe there, somebody who can inhabit this mad scientist energy. And of course, maybe somebody like Rami Youssef or somebody for the sort of journalist who's trapped in this environment. to witness.
I don't know if RDJ is the right person. He could probably do it, but
that was the one I was least sure about.
Yeah, I couldn't see him as being menacing enough. I feel
it would be a challenge for him. Maybe his Oscar-winning role. So, but yes, open to other suggestions.
I really like Robert Downey Jr., so I don't want him to be the menacing side.
Well, eventually he's kind of the hero. I mean, it goes well. She's remade with all of her prior health and vigor and without her illness. So it's really this, and of course it goes back to his own experience with the Keeley cure. This is clearly what was the hope, right, for his own hopefully recovery from alcoholism, that he could be remade without his illness. This was kind of an idea at the time that we could just separate the illness from the person, but clearly it's more in the realm of science fiction.
Jay Shalott is a wealth of knowledge, and I'm lucky to have had him on so many episodes of the podcast so far. In this clip, he talks about the theme of seeing as applied to one of my more recent additions to my favorite science fiction films list, The Thing from Another World.
I like to think of this film as almost one about seeing, how you see things. UFOs, you want to see them. We're thrilled by that rounded shape as the various characters spread their arms on the ice, and this image gradually comes into focus. And we have Scotty saying, holy cats, we've got one. But there's also a fear of seeing these things, of encountering flying saucers and aliens. And this creates some seemingly unresolvable tensions. You want to see the creature. You want to, like Scotty again, the journalist, you want to get a picture. He keeps trying to get a picture throughout the entirety of the film, and he never manages. He has to resort to words at the end. There's also, again, that's that fear of seeing things, and this is one reason why we have one of the airmen having to put the electric blanket over the ice, because seeing this thing gives him the creeps, and unfortunately, it also melts the ice and frees this thing. But there are good ways of seeing and bad ways of seeing. Dr. Carrington, sees things and turns them into secrets that gets people killed. There are the Geiger counters and guards that see things and keep people safe. There's Henry for Henry upbraiding Carrington for not seeing properly, not seeing the importance or the significance of the fact that two of his colleagues have been slaughtered and their throats cut and they're hanging up like the slaughtered dogs. And then we get the coda for the entire film, which is about watching. Watch the skies. It's a film that transforms everybody into appropriate seers, folks who see this world in its fullness, who have a better understanding of this world and are more watchful. And so it tells us, our fears are justified, but so is our curiosity. Curiosity or watchfulness, it's part of a proper fear. And that's what gives a proper place to both the military and the scientists in this movie. They are both watchers after a fashion.
In the episode on It Came from Outer Space, Scott Higgins shares one of the lesser discussed reasons as to why 3D cinema fell out of fashion in the early to mid 1950s. Scott, I just want you to quickly tell us why 3D died, because it wasn't just because people grew out of it.
The myth is that it was glasses, that people didn't want to wear these glasses. And there's some truth in that. There's also truth in the fact that the movies, a lot of them played on just the jump scare. And once you see it once, you haven't seen, I mean, you're kind of done with 3D. I think the truth, though, when you look at these movies, Jack Arnold, The Black Lagoon, like, they do play with depth. There was an aesthetic impulse beyond the jump scare. So it had possibility there. But to show 3D in a theater at this time required both projectors to be showing one reel of film. Two projectors projecting, one is projecting a reel of film representing the right eye, the other projecting the reel of film showing the left eye, combined on the screen through these polarized glasses the audience would wear. And projectionist unions didn't think that this was fair to have one projectionist working two projectors in a booth. And so they quickly organized and demanded that you hire two projectionists to show these films. That's really expensive. And so theaters were willing to do 3D as long as they could recoup their costs. And this was a cost that they couldn't bear. And I think that's like probably the hidden and main reason 3D goes away is that the projectionists refused to project these things with only one member of the union in the booth. That plus the audience is dwindling. I mean, it just became financially like impossible. That's why a film like Dial M for Murder is released in 2D. There's not the willingness to absorb the cost at the theater end.
In the discussion about Them, the first Big Bug feature film, Tom and Matt talk about summer blockbusters and drive-in cinemas. The conversation took some interesting and some horrifying turns. I want to talk briefly about Them being a sort of prototype of a summer blockbuster, because and I think, Tom, you've written a book about teenagers in the 1950s and how they affected cinema. Now, the idea of films coming out in summer, I'm assuming that is to do with school's out for summer and teenagers are coming out. So did that kind of begin in the 50s, or does that have an older history?
Well, it begins in earnest in the 1950s because, like you said, school's out for summer, but also the new consensus medium is television. 1954 is the year in which 4 out of 10 families in America had television in 1954. And the broadcasting historian Eric Barnow has this great line that after the Army McCarthy hearings and I Love Lucy, he says at the end of 1954, few Americans now dared to be without a television. And with the new consensus medium keeping mom and dad at home, who are raising little ones anyway, so it increasingly becomes a medium that needs to draw in adolescents. And this is not my generation, the baby boomers, but it's the first generation of teenagers, the James Dean Rebel Without a Cause generation, who were born either in the late 30s or during the Second World War. They're not boomers born after. And they really are the first generation of teenagers. The teenager is a creature that wasn't invented until the 1950s. You were just kind of a young person or child, and then you got a job and became an adult. And now we have this wonderful intermediate stage where you're basically an American culture at this time and forever after. And then eventually it spreads to Britain and Europe. Once Europe reaches a kind of parity level of prosperity, you have these creatures whose only real function is to spend their discretionary income on popular culture, whether it's like rock and roll or movies or teen magazines or Coca-Cola. That there's just this extraordinary market, and Hollywood eventually realized this is going to be their salvation. That if we can appeal to this market, we can have a going business. That we won't just have the random blockbuster like the Ten Commandments, but that we can now have an operative assembly line business that has a guaranteed audience, both at the theater and increasingly in the drive-ins. And I imagine if you're an historian of British culture, it might seem absolutely extraordinary that there's the American young people, from the age of 16 to 20, can get their driver's license and have a car and go up to a drive-in, which is, what I did in my teenage years. That was sort of like, I don't know in Britain if you had that culture. You probably didn't.
It always rains in the UK, so it really wouldn't work out.
Yeah.
Well, funnily enough, we had 2 drive-ins in the UK during this period.
To go to a drive-in. I would absolutely love to go to a drive-in.
2 drive-ins. Wow, I'm really impressed.
I know, 2 whole drive, and actually, both of them lasted for less than a month. It was the weather and land value. Land value here is higher, so it's super expensive to run a drive-in.
In Montgomery, Alabama, when I was in high school, and needless to say, one was the white drive-in and the other was the black drive-in.
Sure.
Yeah, utterly segregated, and you knew you were making a certain progress in the relationship if the girl went to a drive-in with you. So you'd sort of start out on regular movie theaters and then hopefully work your way up to a drive-in. But that becomes very much a part of teen culture. And there are actually, I think, in Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, she actually goes into a drive-in and breaks things up. Or in The Blob, they go into a midnight movie theater and break things up. That this is how much a part of teen culture motion pictures have become by this time, is you actually see in the teen pics the creature moving into teen space in the drive-in.
It's funny because the position in UK is the kind of teenager emerged during the same period. It mirrors very, very closely. Actually, there have been a number of kind of mirrorings going on there. So, in terms of race, we had the Windrush ship bringing the first kind of mass immigration from the Caribbean to the UK in 48. And so we had race riots in 58. So this was a period of growing tension, which mirrors kind of Brown and the Board of Education. You talk about TV and its kind of penetration of the US market in 54. It reached kind of that tipping point. For us, it was 53 because of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Everybody wanted a telly to watch that. So that's when we hit the tipping. So there's a number of kind of parallels here. But my favorite one is the... So people went to the drive-in as kind of the next level of the relationship after going to the cinema. Of course, without drive-ins, we didn't really have that. But there were kind of kissing seats at the back of the cinema, double seats without an arm in between. And that was how you knew that you were getting there, right? Is that you get to the seats at the back.
Well, it's difficult to explain to the Gen Zers and their older brothers just what a key role that motion pictures played in courtship rituals. I mean, throughout the 20th century. But particularly for teenagers in the 1950s and 1960s, because the movies are a place that are both public, so they're kind of safe for the girl, and but they're also private because it's dark, and so there is an opportunity for cuddling and affection. And I wasn't aware of this extraordinary innovation that you told me about in British theaters, where there were actually seats in the back without an armrest between them. I mean, that's an extraordinary seductive possibility for, I would say, one's imaginative adolescent self. Yeah.
It's funny, I just finished a project a few years ago. We just published a book from it. Myself and Melvin Stokes down at UCL and Emma Pett in York.
I know
where
Melvin.
We collected...
He's a great guy.
Oh, lovely. Melvin, brilliant. Bless him. He's such a chap. But Melvin and I worked together with Emma for a good number of years back in 2013. And then, the book's only just come out, which shows something about the pace of academia, right? But we collected 1,000 people's memories of going to the cinema in the 60s in the UK and built up kind of a people's history of cinema going, which actually I think is the title of the book. And the place of cinemas as a romance setting, the kind of the role of dating, the role of the love seats, the kissing seats in the back, but also kind of the unwanted sexual advances that meant, because then the cinema had been coded as a place where dating and courtship and romance happened. But of course, that then meant that it kind of legitimated unwanted sexual advances as well. So the cinema was also a place of sexual assault, as we would now see it, of sex pests and so forth. So there's a dark and a light to all of this. So I suppose the advantage of the drive-in is you can lock your car door, whereas in the UK, you can't really lock the cinema and keep the man in the raincoat out. But yeah, I find this stuff really interesting. These kind of the parallels and the points of divergence. Yeah, and often those points of divergence are things that come about because of unavoidable facts. The weather, means that you guys can get in your car and go to the drive-in, whereas British teenagers had to fend off, the men in the raincoats because there was nowhere private that you could watch a movie. So
in the early part of the 20th century, when motion pictures first become as sort of a social activity, there's a lot of discourse about what they call mashers. Like if a single woman went to a movie alone, somebody would sit next to her. But I think in most theaters that tended, women went in groups or they went in couples. And then you had ushers who were, at those days, kind of active patrollers of the theater. So it doesn't become that place that's kind of fraught with danger, I think, by the 1920s and 30s, because, of course, they want cinema to be configured as a good, respectable, middle-class place. And so maybe that's a difference between the British experience and the American.
My absolute favourite story from the Memories on the 60s project, which, forgive me, Aisha, I know we've wandered away from them a little bit here. But
yeah, we did used to go back, but tell me the story first. Just because I'm curious.
This is absolutely a couple of film geeks talking about this stuff. You'll find that.
I'm like, I need to move on, but I want to know what you're going to say, so I'm just going to stay, yeah.
I'm afraid it's a really disgusting story, so you'll have to forgive me, but a woman told us a story about her local flea pit cinema, as they called them, which were the cheap cinemas. So they weren't comfortable, they weren't luxurious, they're often just kind of wooden seats. And because it was cheap, she and her friends used to go there. But they had a raked floor in there in order to improve people's views, and that was one of the draws of this cinema. It might be uncomfortable, but at least it's cheap and you'll be able to see. The problem was that they didn't have bathrooms. So the gentleman used to, in the middle of the film, just go to the back of the room and have a wee against the back wall. And it would then roll down under people's feet and cool at the front. And the warmth from the projector would cause it to gradually evaporate and perfume the cinema for the rest of the showing. So, your glamorous drive-ins are a world away from where our 50s and 60s young folk were.
That's as horrifying as the ants in them.
To bring it back.
To bring it back to them.
Thank you for that, Tom.
Yes.
As a cleanse to finish off on a lighter note, I spoke to Jay and Mark about Flash Gordon earlier this year. I asked both of them, considering that there is a remake of Flash Gordon in the works, who they would like to see cast in that film.
I meant to send you a message saying I think this is silly to talk about casting characters, but I'm presuming that we would be aiming for something along the lines of the Guardians of the Galaxy films. Okay. And Chris Pratt is probably at the top of the list for people you would want to put into this kind of role these days, because he's made that kind of role his own. He works. The problem is he doesn't mark off the diversity box, and so Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, becomes the next all-purpose go-to character. And of course, if you've seen another not very good film besides Flash Gordon, and that is the Jungle Cruise Disney film, you've already seen Dwayne Johnson doing a version of the Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, all-American athlete who manages to get through any kind of obstacle that the really baddies throw his way. So Dwayne Johnson, Chris Pratt, they need to get into.
I think actually I hadn't thought of Chris Pratt, and I think that's quite a decent choice. What do you think, Mark?
It depends entirely on tone, doesn't it? I think the two actors who have been approached for the role are Sam Worthington, which suggests they want to do some kind of straight-faced some kind of straight-faced version along the lines of Avatar, or Ryan Reynolds, which suggests they want to crank it up into pastiche parody. And I think in combination, if Taika Waititi does take on directing, he isn't at the moment, he's only a writer and producer, I think that would be an absolute disaster. If we get the Waititi of Thor Ragnarok, it might work. Thor, Love and Thunder, absolutely not. So I was thinking two slightly younger actors, Channing Tatum as Flash, because he can do the comedy and the big puppy eyes, or Ryan Gosling, because as we know, he can do a shirt off now and a beach off. I actually had The Rock under consideration, along with Vin Diesel and Daniel Kaluuya as Voltan.
Those are some big
easy one to cast. It's Pedro Pascal.
Oh, that's a very good choice, I think.
I would think...
No, Jay disagrees.
No, I was thinking of Pedro Pascal earlier today.
Yeah. And I think someone like Anya de Armas would be an interesting aura.
Yeah, she could fill that role quite easily.
What I really want to see is a slightly older Flash towards the end of his career with a busted knee, played by Channing Tatum, with Lupita Nyong'o as Dale Arden. Their marriage is falling apart. We have this younger woman who somehow is the daughter of a perhaps Asian emperor. That's the difficulty. What do you do with Ming?
Yeah.
Yeah, the 2007-8 sci-fi series Caucasianized Ming. And it almost worked, but people hated it. This is very strange. So if you want someone Caucasian in the role, and preferably not in yellow face,
which has been the history of it so far.
Yeah. Willem Dafoe. Mads Mikkelsen.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Or go to the other end, someone like Nicolas Cage or Billy Zane for a more comedy version of
that
Ming.
would go very camp, I feel.
Yeah. But Asian actors, I really, really struggled to think of an Asian actor who could take it on. But I'm wondering what Tony Leung or Andy Lau are doing nowadays. They could probably do with some Hollywood money.
Yeah.
I gave way too much thought to this, didn't I?
No, I'm very grateful that you did. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you have time and you can leave a rating or review for the podcast, please do, as it really helps out the show. Next episode, we will be talking about the original 1954 Japanese Godzilla. So take a look at the show notes to see where you might be able to find that. Thank you. Bye-bye.